Welcome to the Wheeler Centre. It's great to have you here, and especially great to have my two guests as we talk about global game changes, the evolution of the Olympic Games. My name's Tracey Holmes. I'm a professorial fellow at the Canberra University, professorial fellow in sport, I should say, and host of the Sports Ambassador podcast. Before I introduce our two guests, which quite frankly need no introduction, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we meet. And in the language of my husband, who is a Wiradjuri man, I'd like to say Yinjamara to local elders and local First Nations people and all First Nations people with us tonight. Yinjamara means respect. I pay my respects to all First Nations people and all of you, of course, as well as our two panellists here tonight. So without any further ado, two Olympians who need a little intro. Patrick Johnson, a Kanju man from far north Queensland, still Australia's only runner in the 100 metres to have broken the 10-second barrier, and that was decades ago. Please give him a round of applause just for that. He was the first person of non-African descent to break that barrier. Formerly, he worked at DFAT for a good decade or so. Now he's at Sport Integrity Australia as a Culture and Safety Advisor and at the Australian Sports Commission's Executive Leadership Committee. So, Patrick, welcome to you. Next to him, Kieren Perkins, 1,500-metre swimming legend, 11 world records, the first in history to hold the Olympic, the World Championship, the Commonwealth Games and the Pan-Pacific title all concurrently. Well done, Kieren. And as you know, Kieren had somewhat of a career in banking and finance before coming back to sport and the sport that he emerged from, swimming, and was shocked to find that even after 20 years, the very thing that happened every single race day in his sport still happened exactly the same way. Sport can be a Titanic. And now he's in charge of turning that boat around as the CEO of the Australian Sports Commission. Welcome to you, Kieren.
Around, not down. Thank you. Yes.
So I'll start with this because there's so much to delve into in this conversation, and we'd love to take your questions too in the final 15 minutes or so of this hour. But I want to start with this because I remember hearing an interview once with Usain Bolt, who, as you know, he was the 100, 200-metre champion across 3 Olympic Games, and he was asked whether it was him or whether it was Michael Phelps, the American swimmer who had like 23 gold medals, who was the greatest athlete of them all. And Usain Bolt said, look, if I could run down a track sideways, backwards, kicking my legs strangely, I would also have 23 gold medals. So it's definitely not the swimmer. How did that make you feel, Kieren?
You are picking at a scab that's deep, and you've got a runner and a swimmer on stage, and you know where that's going to go. We can just agree to disagree about which sport's more valid and which medal's worth more. Usain was he was fast, but Michael Phelps, how versatile. And was it 5 games? Five or six? Five Olympic? 5 Olympics. Longevity. I think it's a no-brainer. It's Phelps for sure.
Well, let's get into the very personal to start with, and how you both got to become high-profile, high-performance, elite Olympians, because it was an incredibly different path that saw you both reach that pinnacle. Patrick?
Yeah, I think for me, sport was probably just a recreational. I used to live in far north Queensland, so I lived on a boat for about 17 years, so I was actually a better swimmer than actually running, because my whole life was living on a boat, and I started running at 24 years old. So I was at university. I've never done track and field before. I did a bit of touch football, but I was fortunate I was in Canberra. I was at DFAT, and then I was at the Australian National University studying politics and human rights, and they did the University Games, and it was held at the Australian Institute of Sport, and a couple of mates said, well, why don't you try out? You're pretty fast on the touch foot field. And I said, OK, I'll try it. 2 weeks training. I couldn't run past 100 metres. If it's 200 or 400, I thought this is a silly sport because you're too tired. Why would you do this to yourself? But the 100 metres is a shorter distance, and to my surprise, it was 2 weeks training. I won the university games in 10.49 seconds, which put me in the top 4 in the country. And by that time, I had Super League. At the time in 1996, we had NRL looking to get me on the wing. But I thought, well, here's the challenge. And the Australian Institute of Sport at the time, never heard of, you've got to go through a pathway, you've got to go through the opportunities, you've got to be picked, you've got to be nominated through the systems. But they took a chance on me. With no training, no experience in sport, they said, well, we're going to offer you a full-time scholarship. And I think, as you mentioned, the rest is history. But again, if I never had that opportunity and they didn't take that opportunity to say, well, we're going to give you a go, I could easily fail. I could have said, look, I want to do something else, play footy, but they gave me an opportunity. And I think that's probably the big thing. You've got to have pathways and opportunities. And I took it for what it is, and the rest is history.
But, the pathways and opportunities start at quite a young age, hopping into that system. And that system was not available to you. But Kieren, this is part of your job, isn't it? To make sport as widely accessible to as many people as possible in the Australian community, both to participate and enjoy at a young age, but then hop into those pathways so that unbelievable talents like Patrick don't disappear off the page.
Oh, look, absolutely. It is one of the largest titanic shifting challenges that we've got in this country, that really, when it comes down to it, if you want to be a successful elite athlete, your most important trait is being white and wealthy. After that, it gets very, very difficult to find your way through, other than, amazing stories like PJ's. And the truth of our country is that the demographics of our society has shifted over the generations. And the reality is that there is a very large proportion of our population who are not included or not provided safe and easy access for a whole bunch of different reasons. But it actually is something that Australians have to deeply challenge themselves around, because we're sitting here tonight having this conversation because of this deep cultural sense that sport is an Australian thing, that it's deeply part of who we are, how we represent ourselves internationally, and what it is that it means to be Australian. And yet in 2023, a couple of years ago, the World Health Organization did a research into daily activity levels for young people, and Australia ranked 140 out of 146 nations in that research. So I think a lot of the things that we assume or we think are endemic in our society, in the way that we actually provide opportunity to young people and support them, needs some hard thinking.
I think that gives us a great kind of pathway into a lot of the discussion around sport, the Olympics in particular, this idea of myth and myth building, and how that compares to the reality of the situation, and whether ideals are attainable. Even if they're not, should we still strive to try and reach those ideals? And I guess just in regard to that, Patrick, when you talk about making it accessible, and the demographics of Australia have changed so much, we're seeing the rise now in several sports who are going about naming Indigenous teams or First Nations teams. Is that a good thing? Does that show, the next step on the path to development and recognition, or does that show actually that we've failed, and the only way we can identify First Nations athletes and many other minorities is for them to actually have their own team rather than being part of the original main team?
Well, it's probably a real shame, as Kieren's mentioned, that they don't have a place. And I think the creation of the First Nations teams is just a stepping stone, hopefully, to bring them back into the full circle. And I think that's probably the whole ambition around, is identifying, the cultural safe practices, but actually feeling safe in sport. And I think we all deserve that in this country. And I think what I've seen now is, yes, we'll create those Indigenous pathways or multicultural pathways, but how do they come back into the sport? Because then you don't want to segregate. We don't want to again come to a point where we've got all these different teams, but they will not represent the country. And I think that's a way of actually changing the narrative, because again, if you don't change that to create there's a need, then people just presume that it's already been done, or there's no one that wants to play sport. And I think the Olympic Games, as you know, the world plays sport. A great opportunity to bring everyone together from every nationality, every religion. Doesn't matter who you are, black, white or brindle. You should be able to, if you want to play sport, you should be able to, and you feel safe. But this is the first stepping stone, and I think we need to have that first step to bring that focus and understanding there is a gap. Then that next process is to bring them back into the mainstream, which is really important, because again, we want to make sure we actually work together. Because if we segregate, this is the bigger issue, that we'll keep segregating and we'll never get anywhere.
Okay, so let's go right back to the beginning, shall we? Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who decided, it would be a great idea to revive this thing that was the ancient Olympics, and he'd call it the modern Olympics. And this is what he said. He said, Olympism is not a system, it's a state of mind. No single race or era can claim to have the monopoly of it. Which was good, except that his idea of the world was Europe, and it was white and it was male. But he started somewhere, and the Olympics has grown and developed into what we're going to see in Paris for the first time ever. There'll be 50% males and females competing, gender equity for the first time. But if we go back and we look at the challenges that the Olympics has faced along the way, there has been segregation, there's been world wars, there's been the 1936 Nazi Olympic Games, which was anti-Jew and it was anti-black athlete, and the irony of it all was that Jesse Owens emerges as the superstar. We've had these challenges all the way through. Countries have come and gone, political systems have failed, but the Olympics has still survived. Why?
Well, look, I think the ideal that is put forward continues to actually ring true. Ultimately, it's it's an organisation like any, and there will be different qualities of leadership and different ideas of leadership as they ease through the eras. But when it's all said and done, it's an opportunity for human beings to come together and to display their best traits in what should be fair and balanced environment and opportunity. And, I think when each of us have that opportunity to be involved in an Olympic Games, you really do get that exposure. I mean, I know, certainly for me, my first Games in Barcelona in 1992, to turn up there and the magnetic place is the dining hall. There's a lot of different spaces you go into, but really you turn up in the dining hall and it's a room to seat a few thousand athletes. There is food from every nation and every continent spread around the room, but you sit there and you watch all of these people that you've admired, that you've only seen on TV, and we're all as much fans as we are participants in those sorts of environments. And you can't help but be struck by the diversity and the difference that's there in a space where, especially for a lot of the young athletes, where you're probably not really well travelled, you're not particularly highly educated at that period of your life, and it's just an amazing environment. And I know, the current context of the political space that we're in would suggest that, it could be a hotbed of activism or conflict, but outside of the field of play, it is a joyous collection of humanity who come together. And I think that's reflected. I think when we watch it on TV and we see it, athletes cross the finish line from all nations and they congratulate each other, they hug, they cheer, they cry, and those human emotions and all of the connection that comes with it is universal. And it doesn't matter which country you come from, it doesn't matter what your racial background is, what your religious background is, you're sort of distilled down to a human trying to achieve. And even those divisive games you mentioned, like, 36. I mean, we all remember seeing the pictures, obviously.
Yeah, you're not that old, Kieren.
No, I'm not that old. of the athletes on the dais, making their statement around coming together, and it's outlived the political or other aspirations of those that were trying to hold it at the time, and we would. I think it's important that we continue that custodianship in that way.
What was your first experience like, Patrick? You had 2 Olympic Games. Did you very much feel like you were an ambassador for this country inside a United Nations dining hall?
Oh, definitely. I think Sydney 2000, I know, Kieren, we both went to Sydney, so that was my first game. So again, you know, starting sport very late to come to Olympic Games, you know, Olympic Games is incredible pressure, expectation, and you have that on yourself. But for me was understanding what the Olympic Games was all about, and that was about the athletes. It's about the human experience and what we all watch. Great performances, but also what actually it means. You don't have to be a winner. We've seen many examples of people. I mean, the gentleman who was the swimmer,
Eric.
The eel. Eric the eel, yeah.
So he didn't win, but there was that sense of this is what sport's about. Brings people together, unifies. It's, you know, we can talk about higher, faster, stronger together, but it's that human nature that we love just to see people out there giving their best for their country, for their family, for what they need to do. And for me, you're always going to be ambassador, even though at the time we focus on our events, but we know we're bigger than that in the sense of what we represent, our country, our family, but also the Olympic motto, the values. And I think that's probably a bigger emphasis on, you know, who we are as individuals. Because I think we're both in that similar, like 6 hours a day. You had the white line, I had the one track lane in the track, you know what I mean? So we had to do that every day. And of course, you know, I won't speak on behalf of Kieren, but there was something probably not right there in the sense of that I did that every single day for 12 years.
I've often thought that about all athletes. There's something not quite right.
To get 100th of a second.
It's all right, PJ, we're nuts, I know.
But I think this is what it is all about. We love to see what's possible. And that's what the Olympic Games is about. We actually see what it's possible for human beings to create and deliver and how they do that. And I think that's what sport's about. And I think for me, you're always going to be ambassador for sport, but it's your integrity and who you are, and it's part of your culture and how you not only live in the sport, but what do you give back, but also how do you live every day? And it has to be more bigger than sport. We are bigger than sport, but sometimes we're so focused on that little bubble that we focus 12 years to do one thing. But again, hopefully we can contribute to, hopefully inspire the next generation to believe that anything's possible if you put your heart and soul into it.
So what about, you know, athletes are in their little bubble, but they rock up to the Olympic Games. They've been chosen by their country, whichever country that may be. But if we look at the situation now heading into Paris, you've got the Russians and Belarusians who have to go through a special acceptance and invitation by the IOC because their countries are banned, not just because of doping, but because of the war in Ukraine. They can get special permission to compete as neutrals. You've got the situation with Gaza and Israel. You've got politicians around the world. You've got different groups and lobby groups. You've got Five Eyes, you know, who are picking and choosing sides. That pressure is applied to athletes. And athletes emerge from countries where we have media coverage that is wall-to-wall, sometimes one-sided, not very often two-sided. What should athletes do? What should the IOC do? Because the IOC comes under pressure to ban particular countries, to, you know, support this group, not that group. But if they do that as an organisation, are they not failing the very foundations of the Games themselves? And those things you said it stands for when you get into that dining hall with the rest of the world.
Yeah, look, it is fraught, and I think one of the things that really struck me in the original conversation that started to come up when Russia invaded Ukraine was this idea around, you know, should that lead to some kind of sanction, separation, you know, athletes being held accountable for the state, which is a massive departure, and it's actually, you know, a really fascinating slippery slope as well, because, yeah, I checked online before I came here because I just wanted to make sure I got that right. But there's currently more than 110 armed conflicts across the globe right now. And so if we held the lens that we've held on some countries to all, then no one's competing at the Olympics, and we should just shut the thing down. And that definitely is a departure from the higher ideal. And it was a clarification point that I was glad you made, because I was still blindly running along thinking that the Belarus thing was systemic drugs related, which I don't think any of us would argue against, because a clean and fair game is still absolutely imperative. But it's a fraught discussion, and obviously in my day job I have to be somewhat careful about the position taken. But from certainly as an athlete and as somebody who does believe in the power that sport can have to bring people together, to have a more commonly aligned discussion, inclusion is far more valuable than exclusion in the context of an event like the Olympics and the Paralympics, which are, they really have for generations stood apart as a separate and very different expression of human endeavour, and you'd like them to stay that way.
So we say these things and they do sound really great. What did you learn about any other country when you were competing as an Olympian? Did you sit with a North Korean in the dining hall?
No, I don't think North Koreans have ever been allowed in the Games, have they? There's a good question. Some
They
historian
have
will come back. They have been, yeah, no, North Koreans, no. But, look, so you know what? That they're all just human beings. I think, I raced against guys back in the day from, East Germany. I raced against people from the USSR, as it was at that point in time. Sat in buses beside people from, sub-Saharan Africa and these other places. And you very, very quickly, what sport are you in? What are you competing in? And that commonality just strikes up a conversation that, if I'm honest, I'm sitting, on the tram coming here tonight, I wouldn't just randomly speak to the person that's beside me, regardless of what they look like. And in that environment, that commonality brings you together. So I think it was the human part. It was just that none of us are different, gods or not. It's just beautiful in that context. And I must admit, I don't know if it was an era thing as well. But certainly when I came through, there was nobody in the Olympic Village that was driving a deeply political agenda aligned to a very specific, black and white argument like we see today. Like, I think it's one of the public narrative things that we have just somehow lost, that we think every issue is black or white, when in fact nothing in this world is anything other than epically grey. And so I never encountered people that were driving that line. There was athletes for peace there. There was athletes that were talking about hunger and trying to break disease and those sorts of things. But to distill it into this, you're right, you're left, you're on their side or their side stuff, it never went there. Which was obviously always a lot more constructive.
And your own experience, Patrick, is enough done to drive change where change needs to happen, when sport often talks about its ability to be able to do that, to bring people together in the first place and to create greater levels of understanding, but you want that to lead to significant positive change. In your experience, does that happen?
I think it's small steps for quantum leaps, and I think, as you mentioned before, the International Olympic Committee is looking at changing that narrative where athletes do have a voice, but not on the playing field. So there's real opportunity. They're going to have to shift the new norms, because everyone's got a voice. And, we look at all the, as you mentioned, that many conflicts, there's people that are being affected, but they want to be able to not only perform for their country or, represent their sport that they love, but they still want a voice. And I think again, we're talking about real small changes that are happening, and we need the leadership. I mean, we can talk about all the great stuff that the Olympic Games can do and what it will do, and leaving legacy, but we need the leadership to actually say, well, we're going to own this. We need to create this understanding that we have to work on it together. We can't work in an isolation, and I feel there's a real shift happening, and we may talk about it a bit later, but the legacy of what 2032 may look like, because that's in our hands. We've never had that before around 8 years or 10 years at the time. Now it's 8 years. 2 years just went by. What are we going to do? What are we going to stand at? What is sport going to do for us? And I think sport has a unifying opportunity, but what that means to every single person here, to our families, to our kids, to the next generation, that's something we still need to unpack.
And there's, lots of countries have similar discussions with whatever is relevant to their own nation and their own politics and their own challenges. But if we're talking about legacy, it's become a word that you hear so often in sport and around major events. We heard it so often with the FIFA Women's World Cup last year. I can't believe it's a year ago already that event was staged. But is there a danger that legacy becomes a buzzword on a policy paper? How does the legacy document actually find its way into action that results in something we can measure and say, yes, there was positive change there? Or we hoped for there to be this much positive change and there wasn't quite, but it gave us an indication of what we need to do in order for it to be progressed next time. Is legacy static or is it actionable, Kieren?
Look, at the moment it's static, but it is actionable, and it needs to be actionable. I think, and you know me, Tracey, I'm a blindly pragmatic human being, and the reality is that we have to see legacy through the lens of what we can actually achieve and influence and impact, right? Like one of the things when I was listening to Patrick just talking in that last bit, that struck me is, we have to remind ourselves every now and again that this is sport. We're not curing cancer. We haven't changed the disease profile of, it's sport. So let's be reasonable about what we can expect. It can inspire, it can connect, it can bring people together, it can change the dialogue. And so then that question about legacy is, well, what is it that actually we can expect sport to do, and how can we find ways to drive it? The Women's World Cup was a classic example of that. Never before have we seen consistently in this country a sporting event that positively brought people together. The number of stories that I hear from people who attended, that I experienced myself, where, families and mothers and their daughters were happy to go to these events, to be in a stadium filled with, 60, 70, 80,000 people and not feel unsafe, not feel threatened, not feel like their daughters or their sons were going to, come home and ask them a whole bunch of questions about the language and the colour that they've heard at that event that they've never had to kind of reference to their children. Like it was a positive, engaging, safe, beautiful environment, and that's an incredible legacy. The other legacy that we talked about is that it should have inspired more girls to play soccer, and we would love more girls to play soccer, except that we don't have more football fields for them to play in, more clubs that are supporting women's programs and prioritising it equally to the men's programs, and the volunteers and the coaches and so it's great to talk legacy, but don't talk undeliverable legacy, or legacy that we haven't actually prepared for along the way. But there should absolutely be a conversation about it, because I think the other thing that we can't escape in the pragmatic acknowledgement of these things is that none of these events occur without very significant investment from government, and taxpayers deserve to see impact from their hard-earned that goes into this. And sport absolutely has, exponential returns in terms of physical, social and mental health outcomes. It can create ongoing legacy for an environment that you wouldn't otherwise get, and sport can be the catalyst for that. But let's be honest and clear about what that legacy is that we're trying to drive, and make sure that we actually prepare for it appropriately.
It's interesting when you talk about sport and what it can deliver in all of those other areas, and this is the great, I think, necessity for sport to be able to look outside its own bubble and to see what it can impact while still remaining true to its core business, if you like. And one of the examples that comes up time and time again for me is Saudi Arabia and what we're hearing is happening there. We hear negative stories like Live Golf and Greg Norman and taking the big bucks and what have you, but actually it's part of their Vision 2030 program because 63% of their population is under 30. They have a massive obesity problem and they have a massive sugar diabetes problem. And so they have seen sport, they have seen the absolute necessity to get their young demographics out there and doing something physical to change the future of their whole society. And they see sport as the way for doing that. So it's interesting, you know, the way we frame what's happening in sport in other places and the way we use it and talk about it amongst ourselves. Patrick, you're on the board of Brisbane 2032. You're responsible for that legacy being more than a policy document. How are things going?
Yeah, I think, again, when we talk about a legacy piece where we were both at Sydney and different Olympic Games, but we've never had a legacy this long out of the Games. I mean, we look at 10 years, 8 years now, and we've signed a contract with the International Olympic Committee to deliver on this. And again, this is what's influenced a lot of the policy decisions, and what's happening is linking it to 2032 and plus 42. So it has to be something more than just a sporting event. It has to create real change within society. And I think this is an incredible opportunity. And of course, I'm on the board, but it's also, we've got to be realistic as well. How are we actually going to deliver on that? And
what do you actually have to deliver? Because most of us wouldn't know. Yeah, we sign a document with the IOC, great. What does that actually say? What are we responsible for?
Well, it's providing, let's say opportunities for First Nations, more inclusive and diversity, more accessibility, sustainability in the environment. So there's a lot of areas that we have to deliver on, which means that we can't do it in isolation. So we have to work with federal, state and local government, but also got to work with the sports, because if we're not aligned, then we've just got to, as you mentioned, just a signed document that hopefully we're going to deliver on something that we're going to promise. And we've looked at 2032, 2031 was supposedly when we changing the closing the gap initiatives. So there's a real opportunity there where there's a shift and change. And I talk about First Nations. There's an example we have to deliver on this. And again, it's not going to be easy. We have 24 directors on the board itself. But again, how do we influence in the right way with federal, state and local? And we have to ensure that, we've got about 6 or 7 different strategies. Kieren's fully aware of that. But do they talk to each other? And how do they actually talk about real change that will create real long-term impact and ripple effect? And I think at the moment, people see 8 years, it's a long way away. We've got Paris, we've got LA, right? It's very close. And I think we've got to think about what that looks like. And I think there's a real opportunity now, like you've heard there's all issues around state, and that's not our, that's the state government's got to look after that. But for us, it's around how do we create the real understanding through a human rights framework. So there's a lot of work that's been put behind the scenes that we can't just talk about it. We've actually got to action it, and actually it's got to be clear. And I think this is probably the real shift and change that, I'll be honest, I've never seen before, because we've never had a long runway. But also we've got to be very careful of that, because we might think we've got more time to deliver on certain things. And 8 years, it's not long really. I forget, sport itself and life goes very quickly. And I think if you get the right stakeholders, the right people together and the right relationships and communicating how we're going to deliver on that, then I think we're in a good position.
You mentioned human rights, and the IOC has made a distinct kind of pivot towards putting a human rights lens on much of what they do. One of their innovations in the last couple of Olympic Games has been the refugee team. They'll have a team of about 36 competing in Paris as the Olympic refugee team, representing 140 million displaced people. So if it was a country, it's a significant country of people that they are representing. But we always kind of apply human rights to the other. I know we certainly did that in the lead up to the FIFA Men's World Cup in Qatar. For 12 years, about the only media coverage you could read in this country was about Qatar's human rights record. and yet we don't hold that same lens to ourselves here, even though it's different human rights challenges. I get that. But you've got a situation where Brisbane is hosting an Olympic Games and they've actually suspended the state human rights legislation because they're in breach of it. So rather than fixing being in breach of it, they've just suspended it or superseded it, I think is the word that they've used. Are we looking at this differently? Do we judge other people differently to the way we judge ourselves?
Sometimes it's very easy to look outside our own sort of environment and, as you mentioned, judge other people. But I think this is the reality that we're going to have a hard look at each other, and what we're doing in this country. And I think this is a real opportunity. Like, again, this is not about solving all the problems, but we've got to have a clear line of sight. And I think there's a real difference here where we talk about the world's issues, but we're not really sometimes looking at our own issues. And I think this is a real opportunity with the sporting events, Paris coming up, but also what actually happens in the next 8 years. We're going to have to really be serious about what are we going to do differently. And I think we're all going to be accountable. And as I mentioned before, if you don't have the leaders, you don't have that healthy discussion around being honest, around how we're going to change the way sport can influence life and society, which is always an extension, right? But we have to be serious about that. It's no point us saying Brisbane 2030 is going to deliver on this if it's not realistically looking at what we're doing on the ground. But we've got to get all the right stakeholders in understanding what that vision and purpose is. And I think we're on these first steps. And I think, again, I'm very optimistic. Of course, that's probably my life. I've always said we're going to have challenges. We're going to have, areas that we're going to have moments of disagreement. But hopefully we've had that honest discussion around what do we need, not only the better of sport, but better of Australian society. And I think if we're really honest about that with the right leadership and the right people, we will make that change.
So where does Olympic sport sit then? Because we've got some very rich and very powerful sports. We've got AFL, NRL, as we know, and they get government funding. But a lot of the Olympic sports could not survive without Olympic funding. Kieren, you know what it's like because you've got to disperse the government funds to each of the sports and each of the different programs. There's election cycles. It's very difficult to get guarantees and promises, and there's no guarantee once an election's been held that, the same thing is going to keep coming or it's going to keep growing. You've just been through that. You've had a couple of major victories with funding for the AIS to be reboosted and numerous other issues that you've been dealing with. But what is the future for Olympic sports and the Olympics' place inside a very packed sporting agenda in a country like this?
Yeah, look, it's a big question, and there's a lot of elements to that. I mean, the reality is that we use the word sport freely, and it covers an enormous broad range of activities. I mean, obviously, we're here in Victoria. AFL is a sport. It's $1 billion entertainment industry, but they do play a sport. Right down to the smaller sports that we fund that have got less than 1,000. Well, actually, no, you have to have 1,000 people registered playing in the country to be recognised as a sport, and then you move into recreation and other things. So it's a really broad array. I think with the Olympic and Paralympic sports, all of them are their solvency is entirely predicated on government funding. And their ability to continue to sustain the high performance programs that they deliver. And when you look at it, our system is incredibly successful. I mean, we're a small nation by population. The amount of resources that we put into the Olympic and Paralympic sports is not significant relatively globally, but we are incredibly successful. We do a lot with a little. The biggest question, though, in terms of sustainability and where it goes is relevance. And the relevance question is one that is becoming more and more obvious for our system, because at the end of the day, young people have got a lot of choices about what they want to engage with and what it is that they want to do. And as the large commercial sports get bigger, they have more resource, more money, more power, more ability to influence the environment around them. They will continue on their path of incredible growth. And it has been incredible. I mean, a random but fascinating fact, in 2003, Rugby Union and the AFL were commercially equal in terms of value. The last 20 years has been very good for one and not so good for another. Things can change. But for those smaller sports, it's just not the case. And so how do we engage the community? How do we keep it relevant? How do we make sure that people want to be involved and continue to support the environment, because it's predominantly built off the back of volunteers at the community level. And that's where legacy also, I think, is it's another edge to the legacy conversation that we've got to bring in, because often when we talk legacy, we'll talk about stadia or built infrastructure or how we might change something about the environment that the games are being held in. But actually the most significant point of engagement and value that exists in sport is the opportunity for millions of children to play, build a lifelong love and continue that love through. And nothing at all to do with elite sport, nothing at all to do with those commercial sports, other than those environments' ability to inspire, to get the next generation coming through and more people engaged and involved. And so how do we remain relevant? How do we remain engaged? How do we provide a service and an environment that people choose to be a part of? Because we all have choices to make in what it is that we want to spend our time doing. And that's why I think you see, changes at, across all of our environments, but the Olympics, bringing in sports like speed climbing, BMX, skateboard, breaking, the traditionalists all sort of tut and go, well, what's that all about? Well, that's the stuff that young people do. And the sport environment, the only thing sport cannot live without, across all of the things that we want to discuss, the only thing that sport cannot live without is young people who want to play. Like, why would we exist if they didn't play? And so we have to meet them on their terms. We have to understand the things that they want to be a part of. We have to build the right system and process to support them in the events and the environments that they are interested and engaged in. And if we do that, then social licence isn't a problem and relevance will continue on. But it requires change, and it's very hard because we don't like change.
No, we don't like change. Australia's very hard to change. There are some other places that change very, very quickly. We're not in that category. But two things you mentioned there, environment and people. And, the IOC has been looking at that very closely, next generation. And so part of their shift away from getting involved in big, new, shiny stadia is, the urban park, taking the games to where people congregate anyway, the local area where they are skateboarding or rock climbing or breaking. There's a young kid called Jeff Dunn who's going to the Olympics, competing in breaking for Australia. I think he goes by the name of J Attack. Have a look at him on social media. I don't know how many of you have Instagram or TikTok accounts, but he's very active on both of those, and he really is phenomenal. But this is the new way that people are engaging with sport, and I have been quite impressed that the IOC has seen that and has pivoted to that, and they've copped a lot of criticism about it. But you're right, because there's no shortage of people who still want to be Olympians. So there must still be some value in being an Olympian, and the environment around becoming an Olympian is all important. Patrick, when you look at this country, you look at Paris, then there's going to be LA, and then Brisbane. What is it that we should be showcasing to the world? We're not good at changing quickly, but we are very good at being able to host the world and to say, we can give you a good show of what life should be like and how people can come together and share these moments of importance. Kieren mentioned something or other about the FIFA Women's World Cup last year, and what surprised me, it wasn't just the Matildas games. It was every single game, no matter which country was competing. They were fully, applauded and celebrated, and people went there to enjoy part of that celebration. So what is it that Brisbane can show the world in a few years' time?
I think, the real focus really is changing what sports looks like. And we talked about, changing sport with rock climbing, breaking or whatever it is, but I think there's a real shift that we can do leading into Brisbane is make sure sport is for everyone. if you talk about creating pathways, opportunities, the sponsorships and investment. And I think, as you mentioned, there's people that may never get to the Olympic Games, but they may dream of being an Olympian or do something like, e-games or something, but they may not get to the Olympic Games. But I think the sport is so empowering, but it's also how does it really change lives? And I think this is the real opportunity that we have now is we've got to shift the way we think what sport is. It's not only just watching an event. It's a social event. It's creating standards. It's creating a safe environment. It's creating a space that anyone here could do sport. You may be not the Olympian, but you can actually be involved in some way. If it's your local club, next Olympic Games, whatever it is, you have a place in that. And I think usually when we talk about sport, it's only the people that actually do sport. But I'm saying that everyone here can be involved in that. And we've got to shift the way we think, because a lot of as Kieren mentioned, a lot of the sport is on volunteers. And I think there's a real shift that's got to happen in space that, I think sport is just seen as a luxury, which it is, but it's also, we talk about health and well-being. We talk about all these other aspects of social change that I think we haven't really probably captured that. And I think in my day and age, I'm not saying my age, but physical exercise was compulsory. I couldn't believe they then said physical exercise is not compulsory in this country in some areas. And I went, wow, you've just shifted that whole understanding that physical exercise, you don't have to be an elite athlete, but you can actually be healthy and well-being. And then we talk about obesity rates, we talk about all these issues. We all want to be healthier. We all want to live longer. We all want to share those moments with our family and friends. So that social impact of what, we talk about the legacy and the impact, we need to look at that. And I think that capitalises on investment, social change, environmental change, everything else we talk about that we're going to create in the games and what sport should be doing, we actually then clearly articulate what that looks like for everyone. Because again, I find people look at sport and go, well, that's not for me because I'm not sporting. No, sport's for you. And I think we've got to change that narrative.
Yeah, it's about conversation and language, and I'm really interested to know what part of the conversation you'd like to engage with. So if you've got a question for Kieren or Patrick, please raise your hand so that our facilitators can come around the room with a microphone. I think we've already got a couple of questions ready to go. Yep.
All right. Hey guys. So I was born in the mid-'80s, which means my most vivid Olympic memories are Barcelona, Atlanta and Sydney. So it's really cool to have not just two athletes, but a broadcaster who brought those memories up on stage. What I wanted to ask you, we're at that point in the Olympic cycle where a lot of the athletes and past athletes and media personalities are being interviewed because they're all about to go to Paris about their memories. And I've noticed a lot of the media personalities in particular have said Tokyo basically, didn't exist because obviously no one could attend. And then that Rio itself was also not a great Olympics. And that therefore it's the first big Olympics since London. London, Paris, Sydney. By the way, that's not my view at all. I agree with your face there, Kieren. But I think it's great that we had a Games in South America. But are we heading into an era where only the big cities not only will be given the opportunity, but only the big cities really want the opportunity to host the Olympics? Where do the next half a dozen after Brisbane go?
Yeah, look, it's a big challenge, and so this is one of the things that the Olympic movement is trying to address with what they call the new norm. Paris is the first of the new norm games where the vast majority of the events will be held in temporary facilities that have been put in at as minimal expense as possible without disrupting too much of the environment and not having to build new things. And there's ebbs and flows with that. I think Los Angeles, it's an easy one to run the new norm again because you've got an environment where there is lots of sports infrastructure, so you don't need to do more. I personally don't think that casting the new norm or forcing that on Australia is necessarily as valid because we are a wealthy, industrialised country that's got amazing capability to deliver extraordinary things and Southeast Queensland is an environment that needs that infrastructure and social change to enable it to sort of move into a more modern space, and we should own that and be happy to use the Olympics as the catalyst. It's not the reason why, because let's be honest, the Olympics and Paralympic Games are 2-week events, and that's not actually why you build these things. It's so that, you know, for the next 10 generations after that, people in Southeast Queensland have got access to infrastructure that they wouldn't have otherwise had, because the political will wouldn't be there to put it in. And that's all, you know, road, rail, stadia, whatever the case may be. And so, you know, that flexibility has got to become really important. I'm actually not as concerned about that. I can understand where the question comes from, because it is an expensive event, and therefore it's more likely to be moved towards those places that have deep connection and a greater willingness to want to take it on board. But as the new norm evolves and we get better at actually being really clear on what's expected and how the games should be held, and not allowing you know, I think Beijing was the zenith of where it went to, you know, unconstrained, out of control show beyond the sport, that added a whole bunch of expectation and requirement on top of it. The direction back from that is better. We won't ever have a shortage, I don't believe, of countries wanting to take on the games if they're valid and they're relevant. And I also know why you get asked that question in Victoria after what happened with the Commonwealth Games, which is still, you know, we've all still got deep scars about that, because it's not at all been an appropriate outcome. But there was many different ways you could have held the Commonwealth Games in Victoria that wouldn't have cost much money at all, relatively speaking, and that's got to be the start point of the discussion, which I think is where the Olympics is at.
And I think the important thing, we're just a testing ground really leading into Brisbane, and I think even from Paris we'll have lessons learnt around how do we deliver a games, particularly leading to Brisbane. So really it's about listening and learning and building the understanding what's needed, because again, post-Brisbane, there might be a real shift of the learnings that I've learned from Paris and LA to Brisbane. So again, as probably to Kieren's point, I don't think we're going to have shortage, but what it looks like is probably going to be a little bit different, because the new norms will create a real shift of best practices and what actually engages not only what the Olympic Games mean, but if you look at Olympic and Paralympic, as you know, we've talked about, what's post that? We just don't want to have a stadium that is empty. It's got to be created for the community. There's got to be something more deep, and that's the legacy work. And I think, again, you know, if we had the crystal ball of what could look like, I think there's a real opportunity that will evolve along this way, which is going to be the beneficial of all the best practices post-Brisbane. But we're going to have to really learn pretty quickly, because, you know, there's investment in sports is not as high as it used to be, and it's declining. And we look at world economics, we know the investment back in the sport is sort of, you know, declining, which hopefully there's an opportunity to shift that. So I think, like anything, we've got to learn, we've got to be better, we've got to have the best practices, but we need to challenge ourselves moving forward, which will be the shift.
I did actually look this up before I came here tonight, because I know the IOC is very conscious of this too, of making sure that it's just not the same countries and the same cities that are making bids over and over again. And I was quite struck when I saw how many expressions of interest there are for beyond Brisbane. You know, countries we've heard a little bit about: Indonesia, Turkey, India, the Middle East countries are also very involved, Chile, in South America. And I think also we don't hear a lot about the Youth Olympic Games, which are held every 2 years. They have been a real test case scenario for a lot of things with the Olympics that have then been brought into the main games. And it also gives countries and nations the opportunity to host a smaller version of the event, to know whether they're equipped or ready to go for a bigger version. Argentina hosted a Youth Olympic Games. Senegal is going to host the next Summer Youth Olympic Games. And these are countries that are also showing some interest in, you know, the big Olympics, the main game. So, yeah, there is a lot of interest, and it is shifting definitely to different parts of the world, which the IOC appears to be, you know, quite active in proceeding with. Please raise your hand so that our facilitator's coming to you now.
What role can the Olympics play in breaking down national borders? As like in refugees, stopping the boats, that sort of stuff. The role it can play in diluting nationalism.
That is such a big question, and I love it. I really love that question because I wrestle with this all the time. It was meant to be not a political get-together, but the minute you start introducing national flags and every team marches in behind their national flag, you bring all the politics with you. And so it's a big thing. It's a big challenge for the Olympics, isn't it? To say, bring your flags, but leave all your disagreements behind and find a way of, all being humans together without looking at each other through those lenses. You're the athletes, you tell us.
Look, it is very, very difficult, and I think what it comes back to again is that question of, can sport solve the world's ills? Well, no, it can't. However, what it can do is inspire connection and inspire that recognition that we are all in this together. And I mean, the opening ceremony that you wrote, it's a good point. When they walk in, everyone walks in behind a flag, but then that flag gets put down and all of the athletes are together in a big bunch, and all of those differences and those things that held us apart become unimportant. And even, the closing ceremony, I mean, it's one of the things that, as a swimmer, we didn't get to do the opening ceremony because we were always at the front end of the games, but doing the closing ceremony, it's a big party and you're there with everybody from every country, every nation, every background. You've won, you've lost, you've just participated, whatever the sport, whatever the environment. And so it's that inspiration that it can provide, that recognition and acknowledgement that, we are all together on this blue marble, and the things that we think separate us are actually generally not particularly huge if you really look closely at the things that matter to us. We love our families.
That closing ceremony thing of all coming together, that is a true human legacy of the 1956 Olympic Games. And a young Chinese-Australian called John Ian Wing, who watched the opening ceremony and went, no, they should all just be competing together and, marching together as one. And he wrote to the IOC and they read that and they went, that's a really good idea. And it's been happening at the closing ceremony ever since.
There you go.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I didn't know that.
And I think the big thing is, the athletes lead by example. And we mentioned, outside the bubble, you could think of the Olympic Games, they've still got to go back to their countries, go back to their realities of what's happening. But again, this is a real opportunity that the athletes are now leading, where they're not just an athlete that's a sporting event. They're athletes that have opinions, they have passions, they have desires, which I think is a real shift that's happening, where not only you compete in your event, and we probably laugh, Kieren, that we know the athletes that have completed their events very quickly because they're going straight to the ice cream box. But there's a real shift of engaging and actually seeing what sport really is. And I think the Olympic and Paralympic Games does that. It shows truly what we should aspire to be, regardless of black, white, colour, creed, religion. We're part of something special. And I think hopefully that's probably something that we talk about in inspiring or empowering, that why can't you do that? Why do you have to watch the Olympic Games to be inspired? Why can't you do that in your community? And I think that's the shift that hopefully will come to everyone's life through sport, that you can do that as well.
And just to that question about refugees, there's a young Afghan woman called Kimia Yusufi who came to Australia after the Taliban took over. She's competed in 2 Olympics for Afghanistan previously. As you know, women now can't get an education, can't participate in sport, and Australia is hosting a lot of the female athletes from Afghanistan. Kimia has been included in the Afghanistan team in exile, it's been called, and she will compete in her 3rd Olympics from Australia. So that's something we can celebrate. Don't just watch the Australian team, but support the Afghanistan in exile team as well, and support Kimia if you can. There were other questions. Yep, one on over here, I think. Thank you.
This is to Kieren and Patrick. commercialization of the games by allowing professional athletes, highly paid professional athletes, NBA-type players, professional golfers, Tour de France athletes. Have we diminished the spirit of the games?
That's actually a perennial challenge, and it's one that is hotly contested at the Games itself. That, like you talk about subjects that will animate the athletes, they may not want to talk about politics or war, but they'll talk about this. And you know, it really I think comes down to, and this is, you know, a position that I've probably always kind of held because it sits with the ideal. If the Olympics are the most important event that you can win in your sport and you want to be a part of it, then it should be at the Games. If it's not, then we don't need you. You can continue playing your other things. So I do think in the professional codes that becomes a really interesting kind of challenge. You know, if you asked a bunch of NBA players which would they prefer, an NBA championship or an Olympic gold medal as part of the American basketball team, I don't know, would they say winning the gold medal or the ring? It's hard to know, but if it's the gold medal or representing their country, then the more the merrier. Come on in. But the dollars side of it and the money side of it, you know, to be honest, it's actually not relevant. Like, one of my enduring memories of Barcelona, as an example, was the American Dream Team. And I think that was one of the first times that the really big money, big superstars, Jordan, Barkley, you know, type guys turned up. And even though they didn't stay in the accommodation with the rest of us, they still spent an enormous amount of time in the village and in the dining hall and going to other events and being a part of that. The 1998 Commonwealth Games, cricket was included, and the Australian cricket team were there, and War and Warne and these guys all turned up. And we all thought that, oh my God, it's the Australian cricket team, you know, they won't want to hang around with us, you know. And they were desperate to be involved because they could not believe that they had the opportunity to be in this environment with all these other athletes from all these other nations and all these other sports being involved. And so that experience sort of said to me, well, like, they value it. They want to be here because of what it is and what it means, and they're contributing positively. That's okay. That's absolutely great. If they're not, then, you know, then yes, a hard question needs to be asked.
And I think it's just part of sport, unfortunately. I mean, it might be seen as a throwaway line, but this is the evolution of sport, is how we balance that out. And I think, you know, Kieren gave some great examples, but I think there's a classic example where if you're Olympian, I think there's a perception that you're well funded, well supported, so you must be on the same contracts as, you know, if I say AFL or Tour de France or something else. It's not a reality, and I think that's where hopefully, you know, this discussion and hopefully the evolution of what sport is around investment for, you know, athletes, but also sponsorships and stuff like that will bring, hopefully at some stage, some equality. But we know that's not the reality when we talk about different sports. There'll be athletes who, you know, give you a classical example, Usain Bolt, who, you know, if he does anything, he'll get paid huge amount of money outside the, you know, current world champion, but he has a representation in the brand that promotes the sport for being bigger. So I think there's always going to be a balance, but we need that investment because I think Australia, we've relied so much on, you know, the government funding, which I think there's a real opportunity to shift that, and that's what we're looking at, of course, with Brisbane 2032. It's not taxpayers' money, particularly for the OCOG, it's actually self-funded. So there's a real opportunity to shift that, how that looks, and I think these are the different realities that are happening that we have to look at. But again, as athletes, we know we want to get support, but people look at me as an Olympian and go, well, you must be well looked after, you must have a couple of houses, you've done 2 Olympic Games, 4 or 5 world champs and world champs, you're great. And I said, well, no, I've spent 12 years doing a sport that I love, then I've gone back into real life and then started from scratch again. So there's a real opportunity that investment has to happen, but I think it doesn't take away from what sport can do.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've gone 3 minutes over. I apologise for that, but I could keep talking to these two forever, as I'm sure you could. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and I hope you've enjoyed as much as we've enjoyed speaking. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.